Hello, and welcome to this episode of Security Square, our cybersecurity focused series where we feature analyst insights, expert guests, and cover some of the latest news and happenings across the security sector. I'm your host, Shelly Kramer, principal analyst here at Kramer&Co. And today, our conversation is going to focus on cybersecurity for critical infrastructure and why it has to be a capital delivery imperative. I'm joined for this conversation today by Keon McEwen, who's the head of solutions development, industrial cybersecurity at Black Veatch. Keon, welcome. I'm so glad to have you.
Thank you, Kramer. Shelly, it's great to meet you and great to be here.
Absolutely. And you know what? You can call me Kramer. You can call me Kramer. You can call me any of those things. That's what my family's been calling me forever. All right, my friend. Well, to set the stage here a little bit, as I mentioned, cybersecurity for critical infrastructure is a board level issue. But the problem is that in many instances, it's not at all an important focus for organizations. In fact, it's often treated like an afterthought in many capital projects. And in many instances, there's no owner, there's no seat at the table. You've just got blind spots that are baked into the design. And as we all know, blind spots not only don't fix themselves, they can create massive risk for organizations simply by virtue of their existence. And today, with AI threats on the rise and regulatory pressure mounting, this is not simply an IT problem. It's a safety and reliability and business resilience and business continuity issue. So, Keon, that's why I'm so excited to have you here. I know that you spend your days elbows deep in all things critical infrastructure. And I'm looking forward to being able to hear your thoughts on the importance of treating cybersecurity as a foundational design principle alongside things like safety, reliability, and uptime. So are you ready to dive in?
Absolutely.
I love it. I love it. Okay. Before we get into the nerdy tech stuff, walk us through a little bit, if you would, more about yourself and maybe your career journey.
Yeah, Shelly, be happy to. So I started my career as more on the OT side, and that's typical. In this field, we see a lot of people who come either from OT or from IT, and they're melted together to become an OT expert in cybersecurity. So I started my career from the OT side, programming PLC, mainly ABB PLCs for a company that created spray foam. Let's call it. I'm not going to name the company, but they created spray foam, and we had to automate that process in order for them to remove the manual side of it, so it could be more streamlined and recorded and efficiencies created. So in doing that, I got a good understanding of what OT looked like throughout the network and how these level 0 devices communicated up that chain and how that communication can be affected by things on the network. So because of that, I took that knowledge and I was brought over to another company to help build the gap for the maritime industry, to help understand how do we put cybersecurity controls in place for assets that are floating on the oceans.
Easy task.
Yeah, not an easy task, but it was great insight for me because I was bringing the OT aspect and understanding how these systems communicate and connect, and then the aspect of being in the middle of the ocean and getting intermittent connectivity and how do you do things in that type of environment. And then the other thing I realized is that on a vessel, it has every critical infrastructure all condensed in one small form factor.
Right.
So you have water treatment facilities, you have power generation, all these things are happening on this one asset. So it gave me insight into several different critical infrastructures through one form factor. So that was another aspect that I really enjoyed. And then I came to Black Veatch to help not only bring some of that knowledge that I had from OT, but also the cyber aspect. So in my career, I've done a lot of things on the cyber side, everything from standing up as a security operations center where we're monitoring maritime assets and critical infrastructure across the globe, as well as creating a cybersecurity lab where we're doing research and development on OT cybersecurity and some of the tools and techniques that are out there that can be used to help secure and input controls into these environments. That brought me to Black Veatch, and I'm here to help build the solutions and the technologies that we use and partner with some great people in industry to solve some of the problems that I saw in the maritime industry now for the critical infrastructure around our globe.
Well, that's awesome. Thanks so much for indulging me there. That's always one of my favorite parts of these conversations. So let's talk cybersecurity for critical infrastructure. Why in the world has it remained so on the periphery as it relates to capital projects, despite it being recognized as a really high level risk?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in the board level, it is a high priority. Everyone knows it's something that needs to be done, but clarity on how to do it and how to execute it, I think is still in the design phase. For example, if you think about how safety was first initiated and how that has evolved over time, we're still shifting our methods for how we create safety in environments. And I think for cybersecurity, it's along those same lines.
Right.
Um, then we have this delineation between IT and OT. And what does this mean? And I think at the board level, they're still trying to understand that. Who do they
Yeah.
pin the roles on to have the responsibility? Is it the IT professional or is it the OT professional? So that misunderstanding and confusion in that area has also led to it not being adopted the way it needs to be adopted and
Right.
pushed. It creates that a little bit of confusion at that level as well.
Yeah, and I will say that across the board, my experience has been that in some instances, there's board level understanding about cyber and its importance and the risk that it poses to businesses. But the reality of it is, and the data shows that in far too many instances, corporate boards are comprised of people who have perhaps no IT experience whatsoever, no experience with regard to cyber whatsoever. So I think that, I think we're starting to see that change, but that really is a part of this equation that I think plays a role. And so I look forward to, really starting to see more awareness about this and more expertise of that nature being included as an important component of boards.
And now we also have that additional aspect of safety when it comes to cybersecurity. Before it was IT, you might lose data, you might lose the ability to email, but safety wasn't truly impacted. Now that we have these cyber physical components, you have a direct tie to environmental safety and human safety that wasn't there a decade ago.
All right, Keon. So let's talk about this. If cybersecurity is obviously it's a clear win for safety and uptime and cost savings. Why is it still a struggle to get a seat at that capital planning table? Is it something that's a perception issue? Is it a communication gap? You talked a little bit about the communication gap earlier, but or is it something deeper in how critical infrastructure projects are scoped and funded? What's really at play here?
Well, I love this question because it highlights that it's not one solution,
Yeah,
it's not one cause. It's a multifaceted problem that's going to require different approaches and different levers that need to be pulled to solve it. For example, there's no seat at the table for that cyber expertise to come in and be that voice. We have to
right,
have that voice in cyber to say these are the requirements, these are the expectations from a cybersecurity perspective, and these need to be followed from the very beginning. So we need that seat at the table to understand what are the things we need to do and why is it important.
right,
Secondly, I mentioned earlier about the similarities of safety. There's a direct correlation of things we can look back on to see how did we perform in these areas. I mean, safety has become the priority of many operational utilities these days, and that's because they understand it. It has come down from the board level all the way down to your engineers and your operators that understands that now. So that slow process of acclimating those individuals to understand the importance and to tie the importance to what's important for them. You have to
yeah,
speak their language and speak their truth to help them understand it. And I also say the perception is also key. I was speaking their language. That's because everybody perceives it a little differently. I can tell you a story we had where we got on a site and the OT, it was a chief engineer we were talking to, and he had no idea why we needed to be there. And then when I started explaining how he has vendors coming on his site, plugging into his equipment that could
right,
cause malfunctions that he's not aware of and not ready for,
right.
light bulbs went off. And he started sharing stories of these things happening in real life. He had set points changed on him that overflow the tank, and luckily nobody got hurt, but it was a mess they had to clean up. And when he realized that these controls and these things we're doing help solve those problems as well, he became an owner and a champion of cybersecurity in his field.
Yeah, and I think that that's the sort of shows the importance of having these conversations. I mean, Keon, think back to, that Target breach that happened, and was it as long ago as a decade? And that breach, that cybersecurity incident, was the direct result of a vendor accessing systems, and caused a lot of turmoil in the industry. And then we had situations like the Colonial Pipeline situation and things like that. So I think some of this is just educating and having conversations and sharing stories like the one you just shared that help people get to that aha moment and like, oh my gosh, I never thought about this, but this makes perfect sense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's part of their life, and they just don't realize it. You have to
Yeah.
bridge that gap for them. And I think once they understand it, they become vested in it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, I mean, I feel like to a certain extent, you kind of answered this in the prior conversation, but, cybersecurity for critical infrastructure can be framed as a safety issue, in a way that you just demonstrated can resonate with people in the mix. What about with capital project teams in general? How are you working with them to sort of translate cyber risks into their language, which includes things like mitigating hazards and emergency planning and reliability and things like that? How are you sort of bridging that gap and helping to educate on that front?
Yeah, one of the things we see them as very effective, and it is using their processes and using their already established processes to introduce cyber. You mentioned hazard mitigation, using those same hazards that they're thinking of to say what can go wrong, and if something goes wrong, what is the hazards that are in place that can be affected, and then introducing cyber into that process, and understanding that what happens if this is caused by a cyber event. So we're using their same processes, their same understanding, their same flow of information sharing to now tack on the cybersecurity aspect. And that has been very effective at communicating to the different stakeholders involved.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So let's talk a little bit about, everybody wants. I think there's one thing that all humans have in common, and that we want what we want when we want it, and we don't want to go slow, generally speaking. And so when we're talking about project delivery, okay, and we're talking about the procurement process and developing workflows and all of that, I think sometimes there's do we have to do this? I just want to get going, and it's a mindset. And so, what practical steps can people take to be sure that they're embedding cyber into those procurement and engineering workflows without causing, delays or getting in the way of forward progress?
Yeah, I, another great question. I love these questions. For me, this really showcases why we need to move that starting point closer into the design, the
Sure.
requirements building. Because when you start taking that approach and building it in from the very beginning, you're eliminating some of the overwork that has to be done when you're trying to bolt it on. And don't get me wrong, bolting on is effective. It's something we have to do. It's the environment that we live in. But as we evolve and as we change into the direction of more emerging technology and more advanced technology that we're using in these environments, we want to make sure that we're talking about cybersecurity from the very beginning.
Yeah.
The one of the examples I give is monitoring and segmentation. In an already established facility, in order to implement these things, you have to find downtime. You have to find time for the plant to stop operations, to be able to update these equipment, to be able to install these things in that environment, to be able to have these capabilities. But if you think about shifting that before the build process and you're designing it in, you're not looking for downtime to do it. You're establishing these capabilities from the very beginning. And that flows and causes not only cost savings, but time savings as well. So because we're able to shift that starting point further in the process, up early in the process, I think that brings that level of continuity throughout the entire phases.
Yeah, I agree. And to me, and I've been talking about security as a foundational element for a very long time. And this holds true, whether you're talking about capital projects or whether you're talking about product development, or anything that you're building and really starting from a security first mindset, I think is incredibly important. So I love that. I love that viewpoint, Keon, because when you do that, you when you do the hard stuff first, and I think about it, or I explain it like, okay, we're going to build a house. Well, what's the first step in building a house? Of course, after you've done your surveys and you have your designs and your plans and all that sort of thing, but you build a foundation. And that's exactly what we're talking about. You're building a foundation, a foundation of security before you launch into the other steps. And when you can get that out of the way first, it's such an incredible time saver, risk mitigator, and all of those sort of things. So I have a sense that that's maybe how you try to approach operationalizing this.
Absolutely. And getting the right people in that conversation is
Yeah,
critical because you want those people who understand security and can speak to security mind and understand it to
sure.
say, these are the things we need to do. And this is why it's important. And that
Yeah.
then translates into the requirements and the expectations for the other people inside the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, I think that sometimes there's a bit of a blurring of the lines as it relates to responsibility that sometimes allows critical risks to maybe not get the attention they might deserve. And how do organizations, Keon, approach making sure that this accountability for cyber doesn't fall through the cracks between EPCs and OEMs and integrators and owners? How do we make that happen?
Yeah, you have to start with who owns the responsibility.
Yeah,
And at the end of the day, that ownership lies with the asset owner, the owner. It's in their name. They own that responsibility. If something goes wrong, it's their name on the line. So you want to make sure they understand the brevity of that. And then they're doing the steps to pull that through to the other stakeholders. And the
yeah,
EPC is a large part of that as well, because our responsibility is to help mitigate some of that risk for the owner. And in doing that, we have to make sure we're communicating with the OEMs and putting the right specifications in place for cybersecurity to make sure we're mitigating and putting in the right controls to be able to create the cyber resilience that the customer expects at the end of the day.
yeah, yeah. So speaking of risk and, the different approaches that people take, what makes the standard or, sometimes we like the easy path and it's not always the best path, but what makes that standard bolt-on later model for cybersecurity that many of us have embraced over the, course of the last number of years? What makes that even more challenging today?
Well, we have a lot of new technology coming on, and if you're not ready for it, you're not able to adopt it quickly, you're gonna get left behind. So
Yeah,
you want to be able to have the foundation, as you spoke of earlier, to be able to bring these new technologies emerging, the AIs of the world, the big datas of the world, and being able to use those things in OT technology, in OT environments. So that's one of the main reasons why I think we should be doing this. But another one is a story I tell about the seatbelt. If you're thinking about you purchasing a car, a seatbelt is a very critical part of that vehicle. Would you
right.
want to have that seatbelt installed at the factory by the people who created the car to know all the right information of that seatbelt, or did you want to install that seatbelt while you're driving the vehicle down the road
Right.
and operating at the same time? I mean, it just makes sense to install that at the very beginning. So that's one of
Well,
the same
yeah.
analogies we use to help understand why it's better to build it in.
Yeah. Well, and I love that analogy, Keon. And actually, part of that is, do you want to do it yourself or do you want to maybe hire somebody whose qualifications you're really not sure of after the fact to do it? I mean, either way, it's risky and it's a risk you don't need to take.
Yeah,
So, yeah, it makes
absolutely.
perfect sense. So, you mentioned AI. And I will share that I don't think there's a conversation I have today as a tech analyst that doesn't, in some ways, involve AI. So let's talk a little bit about, the reality of it is, as we as a society rush to embrace AI. And by the way, AI, as I know you know, is not something new. AI has been around for a long time, but what we're seeing now is with the rise of generative AI and organizations using generative AI in myriad ways. It's an exciting time. It's a transformational time, but it's also a frightening time as it relates to cybersecurity, because just like we're embracing and excited about and utilizing generative AI to do the things that we want to do and to be more productive and all of these things, so are threat actors. And so, in these days where we have an increase in AI driven threats, more sophistication on the part of threat actors, how do we account for this? How do we behave when we're designing these capital projects to take this into consideration and incorporate thinking about AI and AI driven threats into what it is we're doing?
Yeah, another great question, because we're firm believers in AI and its capabilities and using it
Yeah.
as a tool. So we have three categories for AI in our department. One is AI that we use in our security tools. Some of the tools we use are heavily starting to shift towards that AI threat analysis, where they're providing insights using AI. And then we also have AI in the organization, where you have different parts of the organization that's using AI capabilities outside of the cyber capability. And then we have this third set where we have AI in the wild, where you have your vendors, your third parties, your suppliers that are using AI to conduct their business, that in turn can affect your business. For example, we just had a great example of how a customer or our vendor that someone uses can affect us in the CrowdStrike example. We see how that affected many different people in many different industries because of one dependency. So we have to be able to identify these dependencies by understanding what our vendors and operators and suppliers are doing with AI, and how does that affect us in the long run. And you take these three areas of AI and you're bringing that in to help you understand what is your internal uses and how do you go about mitigating the controls around it. And one of the things we're really spearheading and trying to do is an AI versus AI approach. We're starting to work with a few schools in the area where we're looking to do a challenge where we have the good, well, let me not say good or bad AI, but the red team AI coming in and attacking the blue team AI, and seeing how they respond from an AI capability standpoint. So then that helps us understand, okay, how do we protect against these type of threats? What controls can we put in place to help mitigate some of the effects of these threats? So there's a multifaceted approach of how to establish this, but it's not something we shy away from. It's something we're drawn to, because we believe when you have these great tools that are in the environment, you should be able to capitalize them on and use them. Because if you're not, you're kind of falling behind. And we want to make sure that as a critical infrastructure environment, we're taking advantage of all the tools that's available to us to be able to do the things we need to do.
Yeah, that's the beauty, and I'll admit to bias here because I'm a massive tech nerd, and you are too. And and it's also the beauty of working in an engineering firm environment, right? I mean, these are typically really smart people who love solving problems, who love challenges, to me, working in that environment where you're constantly testing and probing and that sort of thing, like that's how I get my jollies. I mean, but that's also like part of the key to success.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So let's talk collaboration. Engineers, construction leads, cybersecurity teams. What does collaboration amongst all of these kind of people who are involved in these projects look like in a capital project? What are the key touch points, and who needs to be in the room from day one?
Yeah, from day one, I still put it back to that client CISO, that owner CISO, to help establish the expectations and requirements. Because
Yeah.
without those initial expectations and requirements, we're all trying to fill a gap that we don't know what needs to be filled. It has to come from that owner who understands their landscape and their threats. And if that owner doesn't understand it, they need to partner with people to help them understand it. Someone they trust that they can share the information with and be vulnerable and open, so they can get the best effect at the end of the day, the best results.
Yeah.
You have to understand that if there's a byte or a bit involved, cyber should be in the room. There should be a cyber ownership or cyber voice to help discuss how do we mitigate the vulnerabilities that are associated with that. This is not a set it and forget it type of thing. It's something that has to be repetitive. You have to keep going back to it. It's not just one and done. And you have to do it through a handoff approach as well. So there's several different phases through the process, and being able to communicate what each phase is doing and mitigating to the next phase is important as well. We see this quite a bit when we're handing over an asset to the owner at the end of the day. They need to know what their assets are. They need to know asset inventory. They need to know how those assets are communicating to each other. They need to know where the holes are, where the vulnerabilities are, and what we've done to mitigate those things throughout the build process. For us, there's two key things we're trying to pull out of that building phase is capabilities, cyber capabilities, and a clean build. And I'll explain the capabilities because I think that was easy to understand. It's just the capabilities you want at the end of the day. Do you want to be able to monitor your network? Do you want segmentation? Do you want remote access? These type of capabilities we're trying to build in from the very beginning. And then the clean build approach is throughout that build process that you're building that greenfield asset. Are we introducing any other vulnerabilities or any other things we need to be concerned of from a cyber perspective through that build process? And how do we mitigate that introduction along the way to make sure at the end of the day we're providing a clean built asset to our owners?
I love it. I love it. It makes perfect sense. All right, Keon, as we wrap this episode, leave me with one piece of advice, if you would. If someone's listening to this conversation, watching this video, and they're thinking about starting to integrate cyber into construction today, they don't know how, they're not sure to start, they don't know, it's overwhelming. So what do they watch out for? Where do they start? And what do they watch out for so that they can avoid sort of analysis paralysis, which doesn't help anybody?
Yeah, have the conversations, talk.
Yeah.
There's been this stigma in cyber. You need to keep it to yourself. You need to compartmentalize it, keep it siloed. But I think in this new age, we need to start communicating what cyber looks like and why cyber is important and how do we handle and tackle some of the obstacles we're dealing with in cyber, and having that voice throughout the organization to understand what's OT cyber is and how it's linked back to safety and uptime and some of the things you were speaking of earlier. And also start as early as possible. Bring that conversation up to the people who are designing and engineering and coming up with the requirements to help mitigate some of those controls very in the early stages. And it's an emerging area, and it can be a little scary. And we have gone behind this approach that we call cyber asset lifecycle management, which helps show you the approaches of how cyber is controlled throughout the asset's life cycle, whether it be from the build and the design phase all the way to decommissioning. And when you're pulling the asset offline, what are the things you need to keep in mind and keep at the forefront to help mitigate some of the cyber vulnerabilities that are in those phases? Great advice.
Great advice. And I will add something to that, Keon, and my addition is really simple. Sometimes you have to ask for a seat at the table, and sometimes you have to ask multiple times. And so if you're in an organization and you see a project underway or something like that, and you're thinking, well, what the heck? Why am I not involved here? Like, step up, be tenacious, be a pain in the neck, because sometimes that tenacity on the front end can get you that seat at the table that, and sometimes people just aren't thinking, and that's on them, that's not on you. But I feel like, raising your hand, elbowing your way to the table if that's what it takes, but try to do everything you can to be a part of those conversations and a part of those projects, because we all know that you have a lot to contribute to that.
Yeah, you're spot on. Keeping that communication open and having that discussion, I think that brings it up in many different areas. So be open to have that discussion, be the one to speak up, because cyber is a safety concern. Yeah. And when people start understanding that, they start listening to those things, those suggestions. So make sure being vocal is definitely part of that approach.
I love it. I love it. Well, this has been great. Keon McEwen, Head of Solutions Development, Industrial Cybersecurity at Black Veatch. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation, exploring cybersecurity for critical infrastructure and why it has to be treated as a foundational step for capital delivery initiatives. You have been delightful. Thank you so much for making time for me today.
Thanks very much, Shelly, for having me, and I hope we'll talk again soon.
We'll do it again soon. To our viewing and listening audience, I'm Shelly Kramer, Principal Analyst here at Kramer&Co. Thank you so much for spending time with us today on this episode of Security Square, and we'll see you here next time.